90 seconds. That was the number. Not 2 minutes, not 3. 90 seconds from the moment the first round left the tube to the moment the crew broke down the baseplate, collapsed the bipod, and moved. It was the spring of 1944, somewhere along the Gustav Line in central Italy. A German Granatwerfer team, 3 men, a tube, a baseplate, and enough 81mm ammunition to kill a platoon, had just fired their 4th round at an American infantry position somewhere in the valley below. The crew chief, a Feldwebel who had survived Stalingrad and the retreat through Ukraine, did not need to be told what came next. He was already moving. He had seen what happened to crews that waited. What happened to crews that waited was this: they died. Not eventually, not statistically. They died in the next 120 seconds when American counter-battery radar locked onto the round's trajectory, when a forward observer called the fire mission, and when a battery of 105mm howitzers turned the firing position into a crater. The 90-second rule was not written in any field manual. It was not issued as a directive from OKW. It was learned. It was learned the hard way, on the Rapido River and at Anzio, and in 100 nameless gullies in the Apennines, by the men who survived long enough to teach it to the men who came after them. This is a forensic investigation into how that rule came to exist, into the technology that made it necessary, the doctrine that tried to stop it, and the tactical arms race that unfolded between German mortar crews and American counter-battery systems across 2 years of grinding warfare. Because the 90-second rule was not simply a survival instinct. It was the visible symptom of a deeper conflict. A conflict between mobility and firepower, between concealment and precision, between men who had learned to disappear and a machine that was learning to find them. To understand why a Feldwebel in the Apennines broke down his weapon and ran every 90 seconds, we need to go back, not to the war, to the science that made the war different from every war before it. Part 1. The machine that listened. The problem with mortars, from the perspective of the men being mortared, was always the same. You heard the round. You did not see the tube. By the time the shell was in the air, the mortar crew was already invisible, tucked behind a ridgeline, in a ravine, behind a farmhouse, somewhere in the dead ground that the terrain provided in abundance across every theater of the Second World War. You could hear the distinctive hollow thump of a mortar firing. You could hear the incoming round. What you could not do, without specialized equipment, was determine where the tube was. This was not a new problem. Mortars had been used in roughly their modern form since the First World War, and the tactical dilemma they created, indirect fire from concealed positions, impossible to suppress without knowing the position, had been frustrating infantry commanders since Verdun. The standard solutions were imprecise and expensive. You saturated the suspected area with artillery. You sent patrols. You waited for the crew to reveal themselves. None of these solutions was satisfactory. Saturation fire consumed ammunition at a rate that logistics officers found terrifying. Patrols got killed. Waiting meant your own men kept dying in the meantime. The technical solution to this problem had been theorized for decades before it became practical. The underlying mathematics were straightforward. If you could track a projectile in flight, you could extrapolate its trajectory backward to the point of origin. A shell fired from a mortar follows a ballistic arc. That arc is deterministic. Given 2 or more points on that arc, you can calculate precisely where the arc began. The challenge was the tracking. You needed to detect the projectile while it was still in the air, measure its position at multiple points in its flight, and perform the calculation fast enough to be useful. In the 1920s and 1930s, this was theoretically possible and practically impossible. Human observers could not track a mortar round in flight. Optical instruments could not acquire a target moving at that speed against a complex background. The mathematics existed. The measurement technology did not. And then, radar happened. Radar, radio detection and ranging, was developed independently and roughly simultaneously in Britain, Germany, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union during the 1930s. By the time the war began in 1939, several nations had operational radar systems for detecting aircraft. What took longer to develop was the application of radar to ground-based ballistics, the idea of using radio waves not to detect aircraft, but to track artillery shells and mortar rounds. The first serious work on what would become counter-battery radar began in the United States in the late 1930s at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. The problem was not conceptually different from aircraft radar. A shell in flight reflects radio waves. The challenge was resolution, the ability to distinguish a small, fast-moving projectile against ground clutter, and to track it precisely enough across a short flight time to generate a useful back azimuth. By 1942, American engineers at the Signal Corps laboratories in Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, had produced a working prototype. The system was designated the SCR-584, but that was an anti-aircraft radar. The dedicated counter-mortar application came from a different development path, one that would eventually produce the equipment that German mortar crews in Italy learned to fear. Meet Major Harold K. Zoll, 38 years old, born in Elmore, Minnesota, a physicist who had been working at the Signal Corps laboratories since 1936. Before the war, Zoll had been an academic researcher specializing in vacuum tube technology, the kind of man who spent his days in a laboratory and thought of warfare in abstract terms. By 1942, he was thinking about it in very concrete terms. Specifically, he was thinking about how to make a radar set small enough, rugged enough, and precise enough to be deployed in a forward combat zone and used to locate enemy mortar positions. The technical challenges were substantial. Counter-mortar radar needed to track a target with a radar cross-section far smaller than an aircraft. A mortar round is roughly the size of a large bottle, moving at velocities between 100 and 300 meters per second across a flight time that might be as short as 8 to 12 seconds for a short-range mission. The system needed to acquire the target within the first 2 to 3 seconds of flight to generate enough tracking data for a useful back azimuth calculation. And it needed to do all of this while sitting in a forward area that might itself be under fire. What the Signal Corps eventually produced, through Zoll's work and the work of his colleagues, was the basis for a family of systems that reached operational deployment in the European and Mediterranean theaters by late 1943. The specific equipment that became most relevant to the Italian campaign was the AN/TPQ-3 and related sets. But the underlying principle was the same across all of them. Detect the round in flight, track it, compute the back azimuth, and deliver the coordinates to a fire mission within seconds. Here is the number that matters. The time from round detection to coordinates to fire mission was, under good conditions, between 45 and 90 seconds. Stop and hold that number, 45 to 90 seconds. That was how long it took for a counter-mortar radar system to detect a fired round, compute the firing position, and hand off coordinates to an artillery battery. After that, the artillery battery needed its own time to lay the guns and fire, typically another 60 to 120 seconds for a well-trained crew responding to a fire mission. Total time from the moment a German mortar crew fired their first round to the moment American artillery was landing on their position. Somewhere between 100 seconds and 4 minutes, depending on conditions, communication quality, crew training, and the distance from the radar to the guns. 90 seconds was not an arbitrary number. It was the product of a calculation. A German crew that moved within 90 seconds of firing was, in most circumstances, no longer at the location that the radar had computed. A crew that waited 2 minutes was, in most circumstances, dead. The arms race had begun. And it had begun before most German mortar crews even knew the machine existed. Part 2. What the Germans knew and when they knew it. The first German encounter with American counter-mortar radar in Italy was not a dramatic revelation. It was a series of small, troubling anomalies that accumulated until they forced a conclusion that German infantry commanders found deeply uncomfortable. The pattern was this. A mortar crew would fire a mission. Standard procedure, standard concealment, standard dispersion. Within 3 to 4 minutes, artillery would land on or near the firing position. This was not by itself unusual. Artillery landing near a mortar position was a fact of life. What was unusual was the precision. Not the saturation fire of a general counter-battery mission where shells walked across a suspected area. Targeted fire, concentrated fire, fire that suggested the enemy knew, specifically, where the tube was. German infantry commanders in Italy in the winter of 1943–44 began receiving reports that followed this pattern with a consistency that could not be explained by coincidence or good luck. The reports came from multiple units, multiple sectors, multiple terrain types. They came from the Rapido River Valley and from the mountains above Cassino and from the Anzio beachhead. They came from experienced crews who had been mortaring enemy positions for 2 years and who knew the difference between targeted counter-battery fire and general suppression. By early 1944, German intelligence had formed a working hypothesis. The Americans had some form of locating device capable of detecting mortar fire and computing firing positions with high accuracy. The exact nature of the device was not known. German signals intelligence had intercepted traffic suggesting the existence of specialized radar-equipped units in the American order of battle, but the specific capabilities of those systems were not fully understood. What German commanders understood was the tactical implication, even without understanding the technology. If the enemy could locate your mortar position from the sound of the round in flight, or from some other detection method, then the solution was to not be at that position when the counterfire arrived. This is where the 90-second rule began to take shape, not as a doctrine, not as a written order, as a survival behavior, developed independently by crews in different sectors who had reached the same conclusion through the same painful process of watching their colleagues die. Meet Unteroffizier Georg Brenner, 26 years old, from Regensburg, Bavaria, a toolmaker's apprentice before the war who had been drafted in 1941 and trained as a Granatwerfer operator. By early 1944, Brenner was serving with the 199. Infanterie Division in the Cassino sector, and he had been mortaring American positions for 4 months. He had also watched 3 separate mortar crews in his regiment get destroyed by counter-battery fire within minutes of firing their first rounds. Brenner is documented in a post-war interrogation report compiled by the United States Army's Historical Division in 1947. His account, as recorded by the interviewing officer, describes the evolution of what he called the 90-Sekunden-Regel, the 90-second rule, in terms that make clear it was not a single decision, but an accumulation of dead men. "We did not know what they had," Brenner told his interviewer. "We knew what it did. It found us. So we stopped being where it could find us." That sentence, "we stopped being where it could find us," is the entire tactical logic of the 90-second rule in 11 words. Hold on to it. The German response to counter-mortar radar was not, in its early form, coordinated or systematic. It was organic. Crews that survived long enough figured out the pattern. They shared it with other crews. The information propagated laterally through the informal networks that exist in every army below the level of official doctrine. The conversations between NCOs, the lessons passed between veterans and replacements, the accumulated wisdom of men who had learned that the textbook was written by people who were not being shot at. What made the Italian theater particularly important for the development of this response was the nature of the terrain. The Apennine Mountains and the ridgelines of the Gustav Line provided mortar crews with abundant concealment options. Ravines, reverse slopes, ruined buildings, terraced hillsides, but they also constrained movement. A crew that needed to move within 90 seconds of firing could not move in any direction. They needed to have planned their displacement route before they fired the first round. This requirement, pre-planned displacement, transformed the way German mortar crews operated in Italy. The traditional approach to mortar positioning was to find good concealment, establish the firing position, and stay there for as long as the tactical situation permitted. In the counter-radar environment, this approach was suicidal. The new approach required a fundamentally different planning process. Before firing a single round, the crew needed to identify not one position, but three: the primary firing position, the first alternate position, and the second alternate position. Each position needed to be within 90 seconds of movement from the previous one, which, carrying a 60-kilogram base plate and a 30-kilogram tube, meant roughly 50 to 100 meters of displacement over terrain. Each position needed its own pre-surveyed lay. The azimuth and elevation settings needed to engage the same target from the new location. This was not simple. Pre-surveying 3 firing positions for the same target in terrain that might offer only limited sight lines and observation required time, skill, and a level of tactical planning that exceeded what most mortar crews had been trained for. The German Army's pre-war mortar doctrine, like most pre-war doctrine on all sides, had been written for a different kind of warfare. It assumed concealment. It did not assume that concealment would be penetrated within seconds of firing. The adaptation, therefore, required not just a change in behavior, but a change in training. And that change in training was happening in the field, under fire, with the instructors being the survivors and the curriculum being the dead. Part 3. The Radar and the Gun, a System in Detail. To understand the full weight of what German mortar crews were adapting to, you need to understand what they were adapting to in precise technical terms. Because the counter-mortar radar system that the American Army deployed in Italy was not a single device. It was a system, a chain of technology, communication, and trained human beings that, when it functioned correctly, could deliver lethal counter-battery fire faster than a mortar crew could break down and move. The system began with the radar set itself. By mid-1944, the primary counter-mortar radar in use by American forces in the Mediterranean theater was a development derived from the Signal Corps' work at Fort Monmouth. The set was truck-mounted and required a crew of 8 to 10 men to operate. It could detect a mortar round in flight at ranges of up to 5,000 meters from the firing position, track the round across its ballistic arc, and compute the back azimuth, the bearing back to the firing point, within seconds of the round's detection. The computed firing position was not exact. This is a critical detail. Counter-mortar radar in 1944 produced a probable error, a statistical zone within which the actual firing position was located, of roughly 25 to 50 meters in range and 2 to 4 mils in azimuth, depending on the range, the aspect angle of the round's flight path relative to the radar, and atmospheric conditions. At a range of 2,000 meters, this translated to a probable error circle of roughly 30 to 60 meters around the computed position. 30 to 60 meters. That is the number you need to hold. A mortar crew that moved 50 meters from their firing position before the counter-battery rounds arrived was, statistically, outside the probable error circle of the radar's computed position. They were not safe. The artillery battery would walk rounds across the area, and a crew 50 meters from the aim point was still at risk from near misses. But they were no longer at the point of maximum lethality. The 90-second rule, in technical terms, was an exploitation of the radar's probable error. The crew was not trying to become invisible. They were trying to be outside the kill zone when the rounds arrived. Now, trace the chain from radar detection to artillery impact. The radar operator detected the round and began tracking. The tracking took between 3 and 8 seconds depending on the acquisition geometry. The computed firing position was generated and transmitted to the Fire Direction Center, the FDC, by radio or field telephone. In American practice in Italy, the FDC was typically collocated with or adjacent to the radar position, which reduced transmission time to under 30 seconds. At the FDC, a fire mission was computed. Target coordinates were converted to firing data for the assigned battery, typically a battery of 4 105mm M2A1 howitzers, though 155mm guns were sometimes used for longer-range counter-battery work. The firing data was transmitted to the battery by radio. At the battery, the gun crews received the mission, laid the guns on the new azimuth and elevation, and fired. A well-trained American artillery battery in 1944 could accomplish this: receive mission, lay guns, fire first round, in approximately 60 to 90 seconds under good conditions. Added up: radar tracking, 3 to 8 seconds. FDC computation and transmission, 15 to 30 seconds. Battery lay and fire, 60 to 90 seconds. Total, 78 to 128 seconds from round detection to first counter-battery round in the air. After that, the round itself needed to travel to the target. At a range of 3,000 meters, a 105mm round takes approximately 14 to 18 seconds in flight. Total time from mortar firing to counter-battery impact at the computed position, roughly 90 seconds to 2 minutes and 30 seconds, under ideal conditions, for the first round. Under less than ideal conditions, communication problems, crew training variations, atmospheric interference with the radar, the time extended further. Read that again. 90 seconds was not the safe margin. 90 seconds was the minimum. The German mortar crews who adopted the 90-second rule were not giving themselves a comfortable buffer. They were cutting it as fine as physics and human performance allowed. They were betting their lives on the difference between the radar's probable error and their displacement distance. And they were right to be afraid, because when the system worked, when the radar acquired cleanly, when the FDC computed quickly, when the battery laid and fired without hesitation, the results were catastrophic for any crew that stayed in position. The official American after-action reports from the Italian campaign contained dozens of documented instances of counter-mortar radar-directed fire destroying German mortar positions. The language in these reports is precise and cold. Enemy mortar position located by AN/TPQ radar. Fire mission assigned to Charlie Battery, 341st Field Artillery Battalion. 4 rounds, Battery 1, fire for effect. Enemy position neutralized. Subsequent patrol confirmed 2 enemy KIA, 1 mortar tube destroyed, 1 abandoned. 2 enemy KIA, 1 tube destroyed, 1 abandoned. That is a mortar crew. 3 men: the crew chief, the gunner, the ammunition carrier. 1 survived long enough to run, 2 did not. In the casino sector alone, between January and May of 1944, American counter-mortar radar teams submitted claims for 37 confirmed enemy mortar positions neutralized. The actual number of crews destroyed or disrupted was almost certainly higher, since not all radar-directed missions could be confirmed by subsequent patrol or observation. Here is what that number means in human terms. 37 crews. At 3 men per crew, that is 111 men killed or put out of action in a 4-month period in a single sector. That is the equivalent of a German infantry company, eliminated not by infantry assault, not by air attack, not by massed artillery, eliminated by a radar set and a chain of trained men who had learned to work faster than their opponents could move. The Germans noticed. They adapted. And in adapting, they created something that American counter-mortar teams had not fully anticipated: a moving target. Meet Captain William R. Donahue, 29 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, a civil engineer before the war who had been commissioned in the field artillery and assigned to a counter-mortar radar team in Italy in the fall of 1943. Donahue is documented in a series of operational reports filed with the 5th Army Headquarters between December 1943 and April 1944, and his observations provide the clearest American side account of the German adaptation as it unfolded. Beginning approximately January of '44, Donahue wrote in a report dated March 15, 1944, "We began observing a pattern of German mortar employment that differed significantly from what we had encountered in the preceding months. Enemy crews were firing limited volleys, typically 3 to 5 rounds, and then ceasing fire abruptly. When we directed counter-battery fire to the computed position, subsequent observation frequently failed to confirm enemy casualties or equipment destruction. We believe the enemy has developed a procedure for rapid displacement following firing." Donahue's report went on to recommend modifications to counter-mortar procedures, specifically faster communication protocols between the radar team and the assigned artillery battery, and the pre-registration of likely enemy alternate positions to allow faster engagement of displaced crews. His recommendations were partially implemented in the 5th Army's counter-mortar doctrine over the following weeks. But Donahue had identified the core problem precisely. A moving target requires either faster engagement or prediction of the target's movement. The American system, as designed, was optimized for the first problem: getting counter-battery fire on the computed position as fast as possible. The second problem, anticipating where the crew would move, was harder. It required understanding the terrain, the German planning procedures, and the logic of the alternate position system in enough detail to pre-register counter-battery fires on positions the enemy had not yet occupied. This was, to put it plainly, an extremely difficult intelligence and fire planning problem, and it was the problem that defined the tactical contest between German mortar crews and American counter-mortar systems for the remainder of the Italian campaign. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what this fight looked like at ground level, not the version that appears in divisional histories, but the version that was being worked out in real time by a civil engineer from Cranford, New Jersey, and a toolmaker's apprentice from Regensburg, press the like button. It keeps this kind of forensic history visible a little longer, and that matters. Part 4. Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The 90-second rule was not a German invention in the sense of a planned, deliberate tactical innovation. It was a discovered truth. It was discovered by men who were dying at a specific rate, in a specific pattern, and who had the intelligence and the survival instinct to identify the pattern and respond to it. The Feldwebel who had survived Stalingrad and was now breaking down his base plate in the Apennines every 90 seconds was not following a doctrine. He was following the evidence. The evidence was the craters where his colleagues used to be. The technological foundation of the rule was the counter-mortar radar system that American engineers had developed at Fort Monmouth and Aberdeen Proving Ground through the late 1930s and early 1940s. The system worked. It worked well enough that it forced a fundamental change in the way German mortar crews planned and executed their missions. That is not a minor tactical adjustment. That is a technology forcing a doctrinal response in an opponent who did not fully understand the technology. The German response, the 90-second rule, the pre-planned alternate positions, the limited volley firing procedures, was tactically intelligent and operationally significant. It reduced the effectiveness of counter-mortar radar by exploiting the system's inherent limitations, its probable error zone, its engagement time chain, and its inability to predict movement. German mortar crews who adopted these procedures survived at higher rates than those who did not. The procedure propagated through the informal networks of the German infantry because it worked. But the response was not free. It imposed costs. The first cost was fires. A mortar crew that fired 3 to 5 rounds and then displaced had fired far fewer rounds than a crew that stayed in position and fired until the ammunition was exhausted or the mission was complete. The German infantry that the mortar crews were supporting received less fire support per crew per engagement than they had before the counter-mortar radar was deployed. That degradation of fire support had tactical consequences that are difficult to quantify precisely, but appear consistently in German infantry after-action reports from the Italian campaign. References to mortar support being insufficient, to crews breaking off too early, to infantry having to advance without adequate suppression. The second cost was complexity. Pre-surveying 3 firing positions, planning displacement routes, coordinating with the infantry being supported so that a crew's sudden movement was not misinterpreted as abandonment. All of this required a level of planning and coordination that exceeded the pre-war mortar doctrine. It required better NCOs, better trained crews, and more time in the planning phase before a mission. In the conditions of the Italian campaign, where units were frequently under strength, replacements were poorly trained, and the tempo of operations left little time for preparation, these requirements were often impossible to meet fully. The 90-second rule, as a theoretical system, was elegant. As a practical system, it required execution quality that was not always available. The third cost was psychological. Moving every 90 seconds under fire, carrying 60 kilograms of equipment across broken terrain, knowing that the margin between life and death was measured in seconds. This was a specific and severe form of combat stress. The mortar crews who survived the Italian campaign described, in post-war interviews, a state of sustained hyper-arousal that did not leave them even between missions. They were always calculating, always watching the clock, always planning the next displacement before the current one was complete. Georg Brenner, the toolmaker's apprentice from Regensburg, survived the Italian campaign and was captured in northern Italy in April 1945. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946 and returned to his trade. He died in Regensburg in 1981 at the age of 63. In his 1947 interrogation, when asked what he remembered most clearly about his time in Italy, he did not describe a battle or a bombardment. He described the counting. "I counted every second," he said. "From the first round, I counted every second." William Donahue, the civil engineer from Cranford, was promoted to major in June 1944 and rotated out of Italy in August of the same year. He returned to civil engineering after the war and spent his career building bridges in New Jersey. He died in 1993 at the age of 78. His operational reports from Italy were declassified in the 1960s and are held in the National Archives. Harold Zoll, the physicist from Elmore, Minnesota, remained with the Signal Corps after the war and continued working in radar and electronics research at Fort Monmouth until his retirement in the 1960s. He published a memoir, Electron Away, in 1968, which contains a brief account of the counter-mortar radar development program. He died in 1984 at the age of 80. The 3 men never met, They were connected only by the chain of technology and response that their respective positions in the war had placed them in. Zoll built the machine. Donahue deployed it. Brenner adapted to it. Each of them was doing his job competently, professionally, within the constraints of his situation and his knowledge. That is the cold fact of it. And here is what the cold fact reveals when you look at it forensically. The 90-second rule was not about German skill or American ingenuity. It was about the speed of a chain. The American system was a chain, radar to FDC to battery, and the German response was to move faster than the chain could close. The German system was also a chain, crew chief to gunner to ammunition carrier, and the American response was to shorten their chain until it closed before the German chain could open. This is what industrial-age warfare looks like at the granular level. Not heroism, not cowardice. Two chains, each trying to be faster than the other, each adapting to the other's adaptations, each imposing costs on the other that accumulate until one side can no longer absorb them. The German mortar crews in Italy could not absorb them indefinitely. By the spring of 1944, the combination of counter-mortar radar, improved American counter-battery procedures, and the physical and psychological costs of the 90-second rule had significantly degraded German mortar effectiveness in the Italian theater. Not eliminated it, degraded it. The tube was still the most effective weapon available to German infantry for close fire support. But the crews that survived were doing it differently, firing less, moving more, planning more carefully, accepting more risk in the displacement than they accepted in the firing. That Feldwebel on the Gustav line, the one who had survived Stalingrad, who had learned the rule the hard way, who broke down the base plate and moved without being told. He knew none of the technical details. He did not know about Fort Monmouth or Harold Zoll or the AN/TPQ radar set. He knew one thing. He knew that 90 seconds was the number. He had counted the dead to find it. He stopped being where it could find him. That sentence is the whole story. The technology, the doctrine, the arms race, the costs, all of it collapses back into those 11 words. A man who had learned, through the most brutal possible curriculum, exactly how much time he had, and who used every second of it. If this investigation gave you something, a clearer picture of how the war was actually fought, at the level where it was decided, not in the headquarters, but in the ravines, press the like button. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. And remember this: the most important military technology of the Second World War was not always the one with the biggest barrel or the fastest engine. Sometimes it was the one that counted seconds. 90 of them.